sanctuary constructed by reverence and desire to uphold an ancient legend also holds below an underground graveyard now filled with death and despair, where the king had sent his soldiers of all kind, including mercenaries, to uproot the evil that haunts the 5-layered graveyard, now reduced to a dark and decrepit dungeon. This is Kingsfield. Kingsfield is a game without a field, contrary to the name presented. The title and the screenshot seen on the back glimpsed a promise of daring dangers and a quest worth finishing. Kingsfield represented intense and ambitious desires unique to the 90s, whereas today the nostalgia that we experienced then can be reimagined on a whim thanks to the technologies of today. This game was more than just a launch title to those who had discovered it later, but it was a game that could be seen as the domino that would eventually create a catalyst event that would then spawn one of the most iconic RPG series of all time, the Souls series. My introduction to From Software games was from a Xbox 360 copy of the original Dark Souls from Cache Converters. I had no idea what it was about, and my experience was completely blind. Naturally, I had no idea what I was doing, but the strange and mesmerizing sense of atmosphere and the wondrous discoveries that truly felt like my own made for not only one of the most unique games that I've ever played, but it was also the most impactful game of my life. Ever since then, I've been a fan of the Souls games, including Sekiro, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring. Each game was filled to the brim with extensive and ambiguous lore, a simple but challenging and satisfying combat system that has spread across other genres, and beautiful dark fantasy set pieces that made you want to explore. It's their most successful era, and Elden Ring's success has taken them further into the stratosphere. But, as I would discover over time, the studio, in fact, had a treasure trove of other games that showed a studio capable of doing more than just Souls games. My recent journey took me on a brief but interesting course while I wait to see how Doom the Dark Ages runs on my PC, to the game that pretty much started it all from Software's career into game development, and that is the original Kingsfield. Now, before looking into the Kingsfield games, I did some digging into the order of games to play, and this is where things got a bit confusing at first. The version that I had played was the Japanese version. It was only ever released in Japan, and the US version of the game is actually Kingsfield 2. So the differences between the two are not just in their translations, but also, well, in the content. So unless you knew of the game's existence back in the US or you lived in Japan at the time, this game would have gone under your radar, not realizing that you were playing a sequel if you had the US version of Kingsfield. Well, I wanted to start with the very first game, and before diving into it, I knew what I was signing up for here. On the surface, it's a very ugly looking game by modern standards, primitive in fact due to the many limitations surrounding the PS1's hardware and how many compromises were made to ensure the right polygons were on display. Back in '94, there was still a ton of sprite-based games being released because they were much easier to make and could produce far more detail in animations and environments. Early 3D in comparison was just very rough at this stage, and games that committed to polygons top to bottom would struggle to run games at an acceptable frame rate, and Kingsfield is no exception in this case. Which is why we would also see games like Resident Evil and Final Fantasy VII opt for pre-rendered backgrounds, a technological compromise to properly visualize the worlds that they wanted to make, since a fully 3D experience would have been a clunky and ugly experience at that time. Kingsfield has 3D in every corner and object that you can imagine, with very low poly visuals, textures, and environments with limited details. But regardless, I still went into the low poly Royal Graveyard, consisting of 5 dungeons, NPCs with no faces, and enemies that can be stun-locked to death with cheap magic spells in addition to attacking afterwards. The story of Kingsfield, as I've come to understand, has you play as a character named John Alfred Forrester, son of Hauser, commander of the Royal Guard. who had delved into the dungeon to save his men from a terrible evil that has cursed and killed many before them, infecting the site, dedicated to the legend known as the Dragon of the Forest, born from a tale of war and salvation. People that remember this legend had prophesied that one day the Dragon of the Forest will return, bringing magical artifacts. And this prophecy set in motion, as well as the main character's desire to find his father, is where our first steps lead, into the first level of Kingsfield. Upon playing through Kingsfield, I discovered and learned quite a few interesting things, and my fascination for older 3D modeling would also magnetize. Its early and primitive 3D models showed me a few things. That no matter how limited the polygons were, the studio did everything they could to make the dungeon not just dangerous in its oppressive nature, but also in the design of its inhabitants, i.e. the creatures that you fight. Whether it be snakes, plant monsters, spiders, skeletons, or other monstrosities. It is evident as to why the king has lost so many men in the attempt to retake the royal cemetery. Some people believe that limitations can often make the most creative and interesting experiences possible. While it's not an absolute statement or a guarantee, it does hold some merit in the context of Kingsfield, because while the texture work and model building is very limited, it's still interesting enough to invite further imagination. This was at a time where our imaginations were far more intense and vividly detailed than what we have now. It is easier than ever before to visualize our ideas into game format, and that is by virtue of today's engines and resources. But From Software in '94 used whatever resources were available to them and worked towards being creative by necessity and by limitations bound to them. Technology of the 90s made studios push to the limits, but it was a slow and gradual and painful push, and in '94 it had a far and long road to go. From level 1 and onward, I could sense something else that the game had, something that I also experienced from the first Dark Souls, and that was the lonely, sometimes comforting and mostly intense atmosphere. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot in the Souls community and From Software games in general, but Kingsfield's atmosphere is strengthened by a few things. One is the placement of fires. Dungeons are generally dark, and the presence of fire lighting a room or lighting the way adds a layer of ambience that makes the rooms feel alive and almost inviting. But what makes it oppressive are the amount of threats that lurk almost every corner, where enemies not only respawn after a while, but can also cause significant harm to you if you're not leveled up enough or aren't equipped better. Now, one of two things may happen. You may either sense the atmosphere that this game tries to achieve, or you may be turned off by the visual presentation as well as the clunky gameplay. And speaking of the gameplay, the movement in general is pretty clunky in itself. Everything feels very tanky, and this was just due to the limitations of the game and not just its graphics, but also what kind of movements and inputs were available. Kingsfield's gameplay is not unlike the dungeon crawlers that we had back then, where they provided a horizontal experience where player-made characters or parties get to live out their D&D fantasy through the computer. Games like Ultima, Elder Scrolls Arena and Daggerfall, the Might and Magic series, Eye of the Beholder and Dungeon Master were spawned from the love and nerdiness of pen and paper RPGs, the love of gathering a group of like-minded nerds for a session of D&D, or maybe even Pathfinder or something similar to that. Kingsfield provides a dungeon crawling experience committed to 3D but without the dice roll. So don't worry, you don't need to pretend to understand AD&D to understand Kingsfield's mechanics, because it's actually quite simple. At the beginning, you're in a pretty vulnerable position. You're low leveled, your magic is weak, and your weapon takes multiple hits to even take down a skeleton, whereas they can annihilate you in a hit or two. This situation I found myself in reminded me of how in Dark Souls you would have the freedom to go your own path towards the goals. But you would also end up in areas you're just simply not prepared for, let alone strong enough to survive. When you die, you're loaded back at the beginning of the level, but if you manage to find a cross that acts as a save, then you load back to your previous save and continue onward. And trust me, you're going to want to save as often as you can. As you progress, you'll gradually level up your character through strength and magic. It's not an RPG in the sense of character creation through choice of race or classes. Your character is already established and has experience in both melee and magic. To train both, you'll have to fight enemies using spells to level magic and applying damage with your weapon to level up strength. Over time, your character will level up overall and will become strong enough to tackle areas that you couldn't before. Since the enemies infinitely respawn, this also provides opportunities to grind out gold, to buy items from the shops on the first floor, and to also obtain experience needed to acquire sword magic, and to also lead towards beating the game. It's hard at the beginning, but gets somewhat easier towards the end, at least until level 5. Enemies come in different shapes and sizes and will apply different effects to you, such as poison, curse, paralysis, or dark, which darkens your vision. Some of them also have ranged attacks you'll want to watch out for, which is where strafing comes into hand. However, due to how many narrow rooms you'll often find yourself in, it's oftentimes difficult to utilize strafing when it becomes vital to your success in a fight against multiple ranged enemies. One workaround that I found is to align myself in a position where the enemy behind the one that I'm actively fighting is firing projectiles on its back. That way I can avoid multiple attacks simultaneously and focus on the one target. Also, replenishing magic is extremely annoying in this game, but there are a few ways you can get it back. You can restore this fountain on level 1 by finding the dragon cup and placing it back where it belongs. This fountain, once restored, fills both your health and magic if you're in a desperate need, and you can use it as many times as you want. You also have dragon tree fruit, which will do the same thing, except with the ability to use it as many times as possible. However, make sure that you have one for this character that plays the harp. Give it to this person and you'll get the harp that can then create bridges. And that's another thing, the rewards for exploration and discovering NPCs. In its limited capacity, the game does a great job of rewarding the player with useful items that enhances their growing strength, and finding NPCs makes the place less lonely, but all the more eerier when you think about it. Not only do you not feel welcome, but you also feel like you really shouldn't be here either. But because of your mission and your want for answers, you have no choice but to descend further into the abyss, and each level it becomes more apparent that something has gone wrong here. The simple and brief interactions with people showed that From Software had been doing atmospheric storytelling long before Demon's Souls was ever a thing, where every NPC was an unexpected surprise, coupled with the surprise of not being attacked all of a sudden. Some of them even have a quest of their own reasons for being in the dungeon, like with the priest that requires a golden cross stolen from him, Heinz requiring a dragon tree fruit to cure his ailment, these wizards needing an item to convince them that you need to learn magic, and assembling the Moonlight Sword. That's right, the very same weapon that you've seen in the Souls games, in Armored Core, in Bloodborne, and in Elden Ring. This is where the legend of the sword truly started. It's incredible to see just how this one weapon has carried over decades of game development, reincarnating in many of From Software's games, not only as an Easter egg, but as a homage to the game that kickstarted their journey in game development. In my playthrough, I didn't really end up using the Moonlight Sword that much, because by the time I got to the end, including the final boss, I was already wrecking shit with the Kalishamard's sword magic. So I didn't even need the Moonlight Sword, and I couldn't be bothered leveling up my strength and magic to be able to use its sword magic, which by the way is stupidly powerful. But assembling the Moonlight Sword is still important so that you can unlock the dragon doors across all of the levels, that you can backtrack to by the way. And here is another display of brilliance to Kingsfield's level design. It's not just a sequence of unique dungeons across a narrative, it's one giant dungeon with 5 layers. Each level has its own requirements to progress forward, items and secrets to discover, and new gear to obtain. When you do unlock the dragon doors, you also get access to endgame gear that will help you clear the final level, and it adds to the reward factor that this game has in spades. Now, speaking on the matter of sword magic, the Kalishamard is busted. When you reach a certain stat between magic and strength, you unlock sword magic, and weapons in this game have their own magic spells. The Kalishamard ended up being my favourite weapon because of its attack speed and the broken sword magic that it has. When you activate magic while attacking with the sword, it shoots out a volley of projectiles, which at a high level shreds even level 5 opponents, and trust me, you're going to want to kill those skeletons before they even lift a finger, lest you want to experience nuclear levels of damage. The weapon also helped immensely with the final boss as well. Thank you, Josh. For those that want to know though, the magic is powerful as shit with the Moonlight Sword. But like I said, you need to level up your stats quite a lot just to be able to use it. And by the end, I just couldn't be bothered grinding. Leveling in itself takes time, and it will be a while until you can finally utilize it. And also, a lot of the enemies can only attack in one direction, so definitely make use of baiting enemies to carry out an animation and then punish them with your own. And if you don't have sword magic yet, use the first magic spell to stun the enemy and then follow it up with your melee attack. But make sure that your strength attack is fully charged first before attacking, otherwise if you just mash the attack button, you won't do anywhere near as much damage compared to say a fully charged attack, so keep that in mind. And also you can only activate the magic spell once your attack meter is fully up. Keeping all this in mind, these strategies will ensure that they can never get in a hit, and before you know it, even the most powerful enemies will drop to the floor in seconds. The combat in itself is very archaic and janky, and multiple enemies nuke the frame rate in the room. Again, this is a consequence of committing to a fully 3D project, and many compromises were made, where other polygons were put aside in favor of others that service the gameplay better. Hell, there's not even a main menu to gawk at. You're just thrust into the adventure and that's it. Overall, I'm glad I gave From Software's first game a chance. As someone who's been a fan of From Software since the first Dark Souls, it's amazing to see how daring they were to push things forward right out of the gates. Kingsfield has quite a lot of charm and jank, but it is also a game that invites a sense of wonder and curiosity where beyond its dated visuals, you want to know more about what's going on in its world, what happened to the other characters at the end of your journey, and what would come next after this entry. Well, there were other Kingsfield releases including Shadow Tower, which is similar but with its own dark aesthetics to match. It's easy to get lost in this game, even with the game's maps. A lot of the texture work is limited and gradually mundane, and enemies leave a lot to be desired. But the foundations here were quite strong. So strong that the studio still makes callbacks to it, even if it's in the guise of a holy sword guarded by moonlight. I would encourage people that are looking for old school dungeon crawlers or RPGs, or just people who are fans of From Software to approach Kingsfield with an open mind. This week will undoubtedly be busy. Soon I'm going to try and run the Dark Ages, and if all goes well, hopefully I'll be able to enjoy it. But if you don't mind rewinding the clock here and there in game development history, give the original Kingsfield a go. It's pretty good. Stay safe everyone, and thanks for watching.